He was also proud that he had delivered more than one baby in the ambulance. I think maybe 3 or 4 babies had been delivered. And every so often now, I'll have somebody say, well, your dad took me when I was a teenager to Springfield whenever I broke my leg. Or a lady the other day said she reminded me that she had actually delivered a baby in the ambulance when my dad was on the way to take her to Columbia.
In 1955, Dorsey and Bethel Howe purchased Holman Funeral Home. For years, Dorsey had been the steady hand guiding the business, while Elmer Holman pursued new ventures. But after a devastating back injury left Holman unable to continue, the Howes stepped in, beginning what would become a 3-generation legacy. Although the Howe name wouldn't appear on the sign for another 40 years, the influence shaped the business from day one. In this episode, we turn back to a nearly forgotten chapter of funeral home history, the ambulance service. For decades, the Howes not only cared for the grieving families, but also raced down dark county roads, answering emergency calls, delivering babies, and saving lives, all while building the foundation for the funeral home that still bears both names today.
They were very busy with the ambulance service still, and just that's a huge part of what in the 50s and the 60s and to the 70s, the ambulance service was a very, very vital part of what was going on here, because it was so important that that emergency ambulance service be provided in a timely fashion.
Imagine it's the 1950s. There's a car crash on a county road, a sudden illness in the middle of the night, and you need help. But you don't dial 911. Instead, you pick up the phone and call the local funeral home. For the better part of a century, this was the reality for millions of Americans. Funeral homes became the default ambulance providers out of simple necessity. In many towns, the undertaker's hearse was the only vehicle long enough to carry a person on a stretcher. And the local funeral director was always on call, 24 hours a day, ready to respond at a moment's notice. In rural America, they were often the only lifeline available.
Growing up in the funeral business was very, very interesting, and it was sort of unique in a lot of ways. While we never did live in the funeral home building, we always had someone here who lived in an apartment upstairs, and that person was responsible for dispatching whoever was on call, and we were also running emergency ambulances in that time. So you had to have someone who received the call, and then they would call whoever was on call to make the ambulance call. And when the phone rang at my house, anytime the telephone rang, whenever my father was home, a hush fell on the house. Because my father had to be able to answer the phone. I just remember with such vividness the sacred obligation whenever that phone rang, that whoever answered it, if it was a call from the funeral home with a ambulance call or even a death call, that there was silence. So whoever was taking that call, so those were the kind of things that made our home very different than many people, because the telephone was really a sacred thing that we had to respond and to give a great deal of respect to.
For a unique period in the 20th century, a single vehicle served 2 starkly different purposes: carrying the sick and injured to the hospital and carrying the deceased to their final rest. This was the combination car. Born from practicality, these vehicles were the workhorses for thousands of American funeral homes that also ran the local ambulance service. Professional coach builders would take high-end chassis from Cadillac and Oldsmobile and transform it. The design was ingenious. A removable beacon light could be bolted to the roof. Inside, floor panels often had casket rollers on one side and a smooth surface for gurney on the other. Removable landau bars on the rear windows hid their dual purposes, allowing the car to look like a hearse for a funeral and an ambulance for emergency. But their time was short. The Highway Safety Act of 1966 brought strict new federal standards for ambulance design, equipment, and headroom that the low-profile combination cars couldn't meet.
I remember one time that there was a young boy who was in our elementary school who was drowned. And I remember my dad going out on the ambulance call, and at that point, I don't think they knew who the young child was who was drowned, but whenever they came back in, they had to tell us that so-and-so had been drowned, and he didn't make it. And I just remember because that was my world. It was the world in which I lived in on a daily basis when someone at my elementary school was drowned. And so I realized that he was in the mix of that whole situation and that it was significant what he was contributing.
In 1966, a landmark report from the National Academy of Sciences changed everything. Titled Accidental Death and Disability, this paper talked about improving America's emergency response and calling for a systematically medically focused solution. That same year, the Highway Safety Act gave federal government power to set national standards for emergency services, shifting ambulances from simple transportation to frontline medical care. By the 1970s, new requirements reshaped the industry. Ambulance had to provide at least 60 inches of headroom so attendants could stand and treat patients. At the same time, training advanced from basic first aid to certified emergency medical technicians, with the first national exam in 1971. For funeral homes, long the backbone of ambulance service, this progress came as a cost. The new vehicles were expensive, and training staff as EMTs added even more. Faced with these rising demands, many funeral homes stepped away from the ambulance business, choosing instead to focus on their primary calling.
All the funeral homes in the area went out of the ambulance business in 1971, and so they were very glad to get out from under that responsibility, because really the relentlessness of that assignment was ever present. It was just so a part of your every being. You had to always be available. And even though that was the same in the funeral home whenever someone passed away, but there was an emergency sense to the ambulance, and their response time of how quickly they would get to the scene was very, very, very quick. And they were very cognizant that that was their responsibility. And I think my father said in the 40-some years that he worked in the ambulance service that he only ever remembered losing one patient in the ambulance. And it was an accident at the highway accident, and he said the person even was probably almost gone whenever he arrived at the scene. And so he was always very proud of that. He was also proud that he had delivered more than one baby in the ambulance. I think maybe 3 or 4 babies had been delivered. And ever so often now, I'll have somebody say, well, your dad took me when I was a teenager to Springfield whenever I broke my leg. Or a lady the other day said she reminded me that she had actually delivered a baby in the ambulance when my dad was on the way to take her to Columbia. And so it's just fun to hear those stories of people that have a real remembrance of that service that was being offered to them.
Thank you for watching The Home. In Part 4, we'll look at Bethel Howe, the matriarch of the Howe family, and her servant dedication to the family, the business, and the community. Special thanks to Kenny and Taylor Howe for granting access to make this documentary possible, to Eric Tudor for the incredible research, and to Luke Kenworthy for the drone footage. And thank you, the viewer, for making this project possible. Download the Lebanon Now app for alerts on upcoming episodes and exclusive extra features. This has been a Lebanon Now documentary presentation.